The moment your enemies feel the safest is usually the moment they've already lost. The pounding on my front door hit hard enough to rattle the family photos hanging in the hallway before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops. 3 sharp knocks. A pause. Then 3 more, louder this time. The red and blue flashes pouring through the living room blinds painted the walls in restless streaks of color, and the low growl of idling police cruisers echoed across our quiet cul-de-sac like distant thunder. I glanced at the digital clock on the microwave. 5:47 a.m. Nobody brings good news before 6 in the morning. The smell of fresh coffee still drifted from the kitchen where I had started the pot only minutes earlier, expecting another ordinary Tuesday. Instead, my driveway looked like the scene of a neighborhood emergency. 2 patrol cars sat nose to tail along the curb. A third SUV had just rolled in behind them. Across the street, curtains shifted as curious neighbors peeked through narrow openings, pretending they weren't watching. And standing at the edge of my lawn with her arms folded so tightly they looked welded together was Patricia Sullivan, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. Even from 40 feet away, I could recognize that smug smile she always wore whenever she believed she'd finally won. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't surprised. She looked excited, like someone waiting for the opening bell of a prize fight she thought had already been fixed. I slowly walked toward the front door, every step making the old oak floor creak beneath my socks. My heartbeat stayed steady, but the air somehow felt heavier than usual, carrying that strange electric silence that settles over a neighborhood right before everyone starts talking. Through the frosted glass beside the door, I could make out the outline of uniformed officers standing patiently on my porch. Professional, calm, hands resting comfortably near their belts. Whatever story they had been told had convinced them this visit couldn't wait until daylight. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just enough to greet them. "Morning, sir," the older officer said politely. "Are you Ryan Walker?" I nodded. "We received a complaint that requires us to investigate." Before I could answer, Patricia took 2 quick steps forward from the sidewalk, eager to insert herself into the conversation. Her expensive perfume drifted ahead of her, barely covering the scent of freshly watered grass. "That's him," she announced confidently. "I've been documenting violations for months. He refuses to cooperate with the HOA. I told you this would eventually happen." She sounded less like a concerned neighbor and more like someone introducing the final witness in a courtroom drama she had rehearsed 100 times in her head. I simply looked at the officers, then back at Patricia. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned weeks earlier that people who desperately want to fight usually end up exposing themselves if you never give them one. Somewhere deeper inside the house, I heard soft footsteps crossing hardwood floors. Slow, measured, familiar. The faint rhythm of polished boots echoed once. Then again, and every instinct I had told me the next few seconds were about to change everything. The sound of those boots stopped just behind me, and even before I turned around, I recognized the quiet confidence that always seemed to fill the room whenever Emily came home from duty. She never rushed. She never made unnecessary noise. Every movement carried the kind of discipline that came from years of serving something bigger than herself. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her standing in the hallway wearing her neatly pressed Army service uniform, her hair secured perfectly, her expression calm despite the flashing lights pouring through the windows. She looked at me first, not at the officers, silently asking if everything was all right. I gave her a small nod because panic had never solved a single problem in our marriage. We had been together for 11 years, and if there was one lesson we had both learned, it was that difficult mornings demanded clear heads instead of loud voices. Before moving to Maple Ridge, life had been wonderfully uncomplicated. I owned a heating and air conditioning company that kept me busy all over the county. Most days began before sunrise, climbing ladders, replacing compressors, crawling through hot attics, and driving thousands of miles every month in my white work truck. Honest work left grease under my fingernails and sore muscles at the end of the day, but I slept well knowing every paycheck came from solving problems for people who appreciated it. Emily often joked that I could identify a failing furnace just by listening to it for 5 seconds. She was probably right. Meanwhile, her career demanded a different kind of discipline: long hours, constant training, and responsibilities that she rarely discussed outside the base. We respected those boundaries because that was simply part of the life we had built together. When we bought this house 8 months earlier, we were looking for something simple. A quiet neighborhood, tree-lined streets, good schools nearby because we hoped to start a family someday. Maple Ridge looked perfect during the open house. Children rode bicycles down clean sidewalks. Neighbors waved from their porches. Fresh mulch-lined flower beds and American flags fluttered gently from front porches in the afternoon breeze. It felt like the kind of place where people borrowed lawn equipment instead of filing complaints about it. That illusion lasted exactly 9 days. The first letter from the Homeowners Association appeared inside our mailbox on the second Monday after we moved in. According to Patricia Sullivan, my work truck looked too commercial for the community image. The following week, she claimed our mailbox numbers were half an inch too small, even though they matched county regulations exactly. A few days later, another notice arrived because our flagpole was allegedly positioned too close to the sidewalk. Then came complaints about trash cans, driveway stains, porch lights, and even the color of the flower pots Emily had chosen during a weekend trip to a local garden center. Every envelope carried the same official logo. Every letter sounded polite on the surface while quietly threatening fines underneath. At first, I assumed Patricia simply enjoyed enforcing rules. Then I started noticing a pattern. She never treated every homeowner the same way. Some neighbors ignored obvious violations without hearing a word from her, while our mailbox seemed to attract another certified letter almost every week. Emily never complained. She simply placed every notice into a neatly labeled folder inside our home office. One folder became two. Two became three. Without realizing it, Patricia was helping us build the most organized paper trail I had ever seen. Patricia Sullivan never yelled across the street or pounded on anyone's door. That would have been too obvious. Her favorite weapon was patience wrapped inside paperwork. Every Tuesday evening, while most of the neighborhood relaxed on their front porches, she cruised through Maple Ridge in her white luxury sport utility vehicle at barely 10 miles per hour, clipboard balanced on the passenger seat, sunglasses hiding eyes that never seemed to miss a single detail. The slow crunch of her tires over the asphalt became as familiar as the sound of the mail truck. At first I thought she was simply taking neighborhood notes for the association. Then I realized she was studying people. She learned who worked late, who traveled, who forgot to pull in their trash cans before sunset, and who looked too busy to fight another violation notice. Somehow our house always seemed to end up at the top of her list. One Saturday morning, I was replacing an outdoor condenser fan for an elderly customer when Emily called to tell me another certified envelope had arrived. This one claimed my company truck violated community aesthetics because my business logo could be seen from the street. The funny part was that 3 other contractors on our block parked plumbing and landscaping vehicles outside every single day without receiving so much as a warning. I drove home that afternoon with the familiar smell of refrigerant still clinging to my work shirt and found Patricia standing near my driveway, taking photographs with her phone. She smiled as though we were old friends. "Just documenting community standards," she said sweetly before slipping the phone back into her purse. I asked whether she had photographed the roofing trailer parked 2 houses away or the recreational vehicle that had been sitting beside the clubhouse for nearly a month. Her smile never changed. "Every property is evaluated individually," she replied before walking away. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected because it explained everything without actually explaining anything. Emily listened quietly while I vented over dinner. The aroma of roasted chicken filled the kitchen, mixing with the faint scent of lemon furniture polish she always used on weekends. She never interrupted. When I finally finished, she simply carried our growing stack of letters into the home office, added the newest notice to the folder, and wrote the date across a yellow sticky note with perfect block handwriting. "Patterns matter," she said. "Facts matter more than feelings." That sentence became the unofficial rule inside our house. We stopped throwing away envelopes. We saved emails, meeting notices, inspection reports, and every receipt connected to the supposed violations. I even installed additional security cameras after noticing Patricia slowing down outside our property almost every evening around the same time. They quietly recorded everything without interfering with anyone. Weeks passed, and the complaints became stranger. One letter claimed our porch light was too bright. Another suggested our American flag remained outside during unsuitable weather despite clear skies. Then came a notice accusing us of creating an intimidating atmosphere simply because my work boots were occasionally left beside the front door after long service calls. Each accusation felt more personal than the last. Looking back now, I realized Patricia had already decided we did not belong in her version of Maple Ridge. She was simply searching for enough excuses to make us leave on our own. The breaking point arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon when the air felt so thick it carried the smell of freshly cut grass and warm pavement all the way into my garage. I was organizing tools after finishing a long service call when I noticed Patricia walking toward my driveway with two members of the Homeowners Association board trailing several steps behind her. All three carried clipboards. All three wore carefully rehearsed expressions that suggested they had already reached their conclusion before speaking a single word. Patricia stopped at the edge of my property without offering so much as a greeting. She held up another envelope as though presenting official evidence in a courtroom. "Ryan," she began with that perfectly polished smile, "your continued refusal to comply with community standards is becoming a serious concern." I accepted the envelope without saying anything. Inside was another violation notice, except this time it listed 6 separate offenses instead of 1. My work truck, decorative lighting, improper storage, unauthorized security cameras, exterior appearance, failure to cooperate with the association. Reading through the pages felt less like reviewing neighborhood rules and more like reading fiction written by someone who desperately wanted it to become reality. I calmly pointed toward the security cameras mounted beneath my roofline and explained that they had been professionally installed, complied with county regulations, and faced only my own property. Patricia barely glanced at them. "Some neighbors have expressed concerns," she replied. I asked which neighbors. She declined to answer. I asked which specific bylaw prohibited them. She changed the subject. Every question seemed to dissolve into another vague reference to community harmony. Emily arrived home a little later that evening and quietly read every page while the smell of grilled burgers drifted over from a nearby backyard. Children laughed somewhere down the street, completely unaware that a different kind of game was unfolding inside our kitchen. She placed the newest notice beside the others and noticed something I had overlooked. Several photographs attached to the complaint had obviously been taken from angles that required someone to stand well inside our property line. "Interesting," she said softly. "Someone crossed onto our yard to collect these." That observation changed everything. We reviewed footage from the security cameras and discovered Patricia walking several feet up our driveway 3 different times over the previous month while taking pictures and making notes. She never knocked. She never asked permission. She simply assumed the rules that applied to everyone else somehow stopped applying to her. Emily saved each video onto a separate hard drive, while I labeled every file with the exact date and time. We still did not contact anyone because the pattern was becoming clearer with every passing week. Patricia was escalating. The following Monday, another certified letter arrived demanding payment of accumulated fines that exceeded $2,000. The notice warned that continued noncompliance could result in legal action and possible involvement of local authorities if association representatives believed public safety had become an issue. That final sentence lingered in my mind far longer than the dollar amount. Public safety. Those 2 words felt strangely out of place among complaints about flower pots and work vehicles. Emily looked at me across the dining table, folded the letter with deliberate precision, and slipped it into the folder beside every other document. Neither of us said much during dinner, but the silence between us carried the same uneasy feeling as dark clouds gathering before a summer storm. Looking back now, that letter was never about collecting fines. It was preparing the excuse Patricia would eventually use to bring strangers wearing badges to our front door before sunrise. From that point forward, I made a decision that probably frustrated Patricia more than anything else I could have done. I stopped reacting. Every certified letter went into the same expanding folder. Every electronic message was downloaded, printed, and backed up. Every conversation was documented with the date, the time, and exactly who had been present. If she wanted an argument, she was going to have one with paper instead of people. That became our routine. Every evening after dinner, Emily and I sat together at the kitchen table with steaming mugs of coffee while the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the background. She reviewed every document with the same careful attention she gave to everything else in her life, highlighting inconsistencies, circling vague language, and placing color-coded tabs along the edges of important pages. I organized digital files from the security cameras, naming each recording by date and timestamp so nothing would ever be difficult to locate. Week after week, the evidence grew without either of us saying much about where it might eventually lead. We simply understood that facts had a way of becoming valuable when emotions finally settled. The security cameras quietly captured more than either of us expected. Patricia frequently walked past our house much more often than she visited any other property on the street. Sometimes she paused near the sidewalk while speaking into her phone. Other times she stood at the edge of our driveway taking photographs from different angles. On several occasions she arrived with another board member, pointing toward our home while holding printed documents in her hand. None of those moments looked dramatic by themselves, but when viewed together over several weeks they revealed a pattern that could not be explained as routine neighborhood business. Meanwhile, I continued living exactly as I always had. I left before sunrise for service appointments. I repaired air conditioners during scorching afternoons, climbed attic ladders, replaced worn-out motors, and answered emergency calls from families trying to survive another hot summer day. Every evening, I returned home to the same quiet neighborhood and the same stack of correspondence waiting inside the mailbox. The smell of fresh mulch, trimmed hedges, and backyard barbecue grills never changed, but the atmosphere around our house certainly did. Some neighbors who had once waved now looked away. Others offered polite smiles that carried a hint of uncertainty, as though they had heard stories but did not know which version to believe. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while loading equipment into my truck, an older neighbor named Frank casually walked across the street carrying a garden hose over his shoulder. He lowered his voice before speaking. "You are not the first family she has done this to," he said quietly. "Most people just pay the fines because fighting takes too much time." Before I could ask another question, he glanced toward Patricia's house and continued walking as if the conversation had never happened. His words stayed with me long after he disappeared behind his fence. That single sentence confirmed what the paperwork had been quietly suggesting all along. This was never about flower pots, parking, or community standards. It was about pressure. Pressure applied slowly enough that people eventually surrendered simply to make it stop. Unfortunately for Patricia, she had chosen the wrong family. Neither Emily nor I believed in winning arguments by speaking louder. We believed in preparation. And while she thought she was building a case against us, she never realized she was carefully helping us build one against her. The older officer standing on my porch shifted his attention from me to the hallway the instant Emily stepped fully into view. The polished brass on her uniform reflected the red and blue lights filtering through the front windows, and for the first time that morning the conversation simply stopped. Even Patricia fell silent. The officer blinked once, looked at Emily's nameplate, then at the insignia on her shoulders before offering a respectful nod. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice noticeably different from only a few seconds earlier. Emily returned the greeting with the same calm professionalism she carried everywhere. She did not demand explanations. She did not mention her position. She simply asked, "Officers, how may we help you today?" The younger officer glanced toward his partner before looking down at the tablet in his hands. "We received a report concerning possible threatening behavior connected to this residence," he explained carefully. Emily looked at me for a brief moment, then back to the officers. "My husband has been inside this home with me since yesterday evening," she replied. "Would you mind explaining the nature of the complaint?" Before either officer could answer, Patricia eagerly stepped forward again. "I have warned them for months," she insisted. "He refuses to follow the association rules. He has surveillance equipment everywhere. He intimidates neighbors. I was afraid the situation might escalate." Her words sounded rehearsed, but something had changed. Instead of immediately accepting her version of events, the officers began asking questions. Specific questions. They requested dates, times, witnesses, copies of previous reports. Patricia hesitated for the first time since arriving. The older officer politely asked whether she had documentation supporting the claim that anyone had been threatened. She reached into her folder and produced several homeowners association violation notices. He examined the first page, then the second, before quietly handing them back. "These appear to be association compliance documents," he said. "Do you have evidence related to the complaint that prompted today's response?" Patricia's confident smile faded just enough for me to notice. Emily remained completely composed beside me, her hands resting naturally at her sides. She never interrupted. She simply listened. The younger officer looked toward the security cameras mounted beneath our roofline. "Do those cameras record continuously?" he asked. I answered honestly. "Yes, they record the exterior of our property 24 hours a day." He nodded thoughtfully. "Would they have captured activity around your driveway during the past several weeks?" "Every day," I replied. The morning air drifting through the open doorway carried the smell of wet grass and fresh coffee, while the neighborhood remained unusually quiet, as though every house on the street was holding its breath. Patricia quickly interrupted before anyone could continue. "Those cameras invade everyone's privacy," she declared. The older officer calmly looked toward the sidewalk, then back at the camera positions. "From what I can see, they appear to be directed at your own property." He paused for a moment before adding, "That is not uncommon." I noticed Patricia tightening her grip on the folder she had carried so confidently only minutes earlier. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, she was no longer controlling the conversation. The officers were following the facts instead of the accusations, and every answer they received seemed to raise another question she had clearly never expected to face. Standing quietly beside Emily, I realized that all those months of collecting letters, preserving video recordings, organizing emails, and documenting every encounter had led to this exact moment. We had not been waiting for an opportunity to argue. We had been waiting for the truth to finally have an audience willing to listen. The older officer asked whether I would be willing to show the recordings from our security cameras, and I answered without hesitation. Absolutely. I stepped aside and invited both officers inside, while Patricia remained standing on the front porch, insisting that everything they needed was already in the complaint she had submitted. The officers exchanged a quick glance before following me into the home office, where Emily had spent months organizing every document with almost unbelievable precision. 3 labeled binders rested neatly on the desk beside an external hard drive, each one arranged by date instead of subject, because timelines tell stories more honestly than opinions ever can. Emily quietly placed the newest Homeowners Association notice on top of the stack before sliding the first binder toward the officers. "Everything is in chronological order," she said calmly. "Emails, certified letters, photographs, video timestamps, and copies of every communication." The older officer slowly turned the pages while his partner connected the hard drive to a department laptop. The room remained almost completely silent except for the faint clicking of computer keys and the soft hum of the air conditioner I had installed myself after we moved into the house. Outside, I could still see flashes of red and blue reflecting across the windows, but inside, the atmosphere had completely changed. Nobody was rushing anymore. Nobody was accepting assumptions. They were following evidence one piece at a time. The first video showed Patricia walking several feet onto our driveway while photographing my truck. Another recording captured her returning 2 days later with another board member, pointing toward our cameras while writing notes on a clipboard. A third clip clearly showed her stepping beyond the property line again to photograph our front porch from an angle that could not have been taken from the public sidewalk. Each recording displayed the date and exact time in the lower corner of the screen. The younger officer paused the video and looked back at the violation notice attached to the same date. The times matched perfectly. He quietly wrote something into his notebook before opening another file. Then came the emails. One message claimed I had ignored multiple requests for cooperation. Emily immediately produced copies of our polite written responses sent within 24 hours of every notice. Another letter accused us of refusing inspections. The calendar attached to our records showed every appointment that Patricia had canceled herself only hours before arriving. Every accusation seemed to lose strength the moment another document appeared beside it. The officers continued comparing dates, reports, photographs, and recordings until the timeline became impossible to ignore. Finally, the older officer asked a question that instantly changed the direction of the investigation. Mrs. Sullivan stated there was threatening behavior, which recording documents that. Nobody answered because there was nothing to show. Patricia, still standing near the front entrance, attempted to explain that she had felt intimidated by the overall situation. The officer politely nodded but returned to his notes without commenting. "Feelings," he explained, were different from documented actions. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the house came from the quiet turning of binder pages. Then the younger officer looked toward his partner and said, almost under his breath, "The timeline does not appear to support the original complaint." Those few words landed with far more weight than any argument I could have made. Months of patience, careful records, and quiet preparation had transformed a one-sided accusation into a completely different conversation. For the first time since Patricia decided to make our family her personal project, the facts were no longer working for her. They were working against her. The atmosphere inside our house shifted so gradually that it almost felt invisible, yet everyone standing there could sense it. The officers were no longer trying to determine whether they had responded to a dangerous situation. They were now trying to understand how that situation had been described in the first place. The older officer carefully closed the final binder and rested both hands on its cover before looking toward Patricia, who had remained unusually quiet since the videos began playing. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said evenly, "we need to clarify several points from your report." She immediately straightened her posture and insisted that she had only acted to protect the neighborhood. She explained that she had been concerned for months, repeating many of the same claims that had filled the violation notices. The officer listened respectfully without interrupting, occasionally glancing back toward the timeline spread across Emily's desk. When Patricia finished, he asked a simple question. "Can you identify a specific incident that required an immediate law enforcement response this morning?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire room. She mentioned community standards. She referred to repeated disagreements. She described feeling uncomfortable. But every answer circled back to opinions rather than documented events. The younger officer quietly compared her statements with the written report displayed on his screen, then looked toward his partner with a thoughtful expression. Emily remained beside me without saying a word. She understood that the strongest evidence never needed someone to argue on its behalf. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight finally reached the tops of the maple trees lining our street, replacing the flashing emergency lights with warm golden reflections across the neighborhood. Curious neighbors who had gathered near their windows earlier were now stepping onto their front porches, pretending to water flowers or collect newspapers while watching from a respectful distance. The older officer thanked us for our cooperation before explaining that the documentation we had provided would be included with the incident record to ensure the complete sequence of events was preserved. He also encouraged everyone involved to resolve future association matters through the established civil procedures rather than allowing neighborhood disputes to become unnecessary emergency responses. Patricia attempted one final protest, insisting that the homeowners association had every right to enforce its rules. The officer politely agreed that associations have responsibilities within the limits of their governing documents, then calmly added that those responsibilities are separate from requesting an emergency police response. That distinction landed harder than any raised voice ever could. As the officers gathered their notes, Frank, my neighbor from across the street, slowly walked toward the sidewalk carrying his coffee mug. He offered me a quiet nod before speaking to the officers. "If you need additional information," he said calmly, "I have seen quite a bit over the past several months." A few more neighbors began drifting closer, each exchanging uncertain glances as though deciding whether it was finally safe to speak. The confidence Patricia had carried onto our property before sunrise was gone. She clutched her folder tightly, but no longer seemed eager to open it. Every page inside suddenly looked much smaller than the organized records sitting on our desk. As the patrol cars prepared to leave, I realized something important. The greatest change that morning was not that anyone had declared us innocent or declared someone else guilty. It was that the story no longer belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the facts, and once the facts were finally seen in their proper order, the foundation beneath Patricia's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble all by itself. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood slowly returned to the peaceful place we had believed we were buying when we first moved into Maple Ridge. The patrol cars never came back. The certified letters stopped appearing in our mailbox. Every Tuesday evening, the familiar sound of Patricia's sport utility vehicle creeping through the neighborhood disappeared, replaced by children laughing as they rode bicycles beneath the tall maple trees and families walking their dogs after dinner. The silence felt different now. It was no longer the uneasy silence of people afraid to speak. It was the comfortable silence of a community beginning to breathe again. A month after that early morning, the Homeowners Association announced a special board meeting open to every homeowner. For the first time since we had arrived, nearly every chair inside the clubhouse was occupied. I sat quietly beside Emily near the back of the room, while neighbors shared experiences that sounded remarkably familiar. Some described receiving unexplained violation notices. Others recalled repeated inspections that never seemed to happen anywhere except certain homes. Frank stood and calmly described what he had witnessed from across the street during the previous several months. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. People simply spoke one at a time, and for the first time, everyone seemed willing to listen. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to commission an independent review of recent enforcement practices and adopt clearer procedures requiring written documentation, consistent standards, and transparent communication for future compliance issues. It was not dramatic. There were no raised voices or theatrical speeches. There was only a quiet decision to replace confusion with accountability. That alone changed everything. Emily squeezed my hand as we walked back to the truck beneath the warm evening sky. The scent of freshly cut grass drifted across the parking lot, and somewhere nearby a sprinkler clicked rhythmically across a lawn. "It is finally over," I said. She smiled gently before answering, "No, it is finally fair." Those words stayed with me long after the meeting ended. The thick binders that had once occupied an entire shelf in our home office eventually found a permanent place inside a storage cabinet in the garage. I never threw them away because they reminded me that preparation is never wasted, even when you hope you will never need it. Every camera remained exactly where it had always been, quietly recording nothing more exciting than delivery drivers, squirrels chasing each other across the fence, and neighbors waving as they passed by. Ironically, the very cameras that Patricia had once criticized became the reason several nearby homeowners decided to install systems of their own, not because they expected conflict, but because they appreciated having an accurate record whenever questions arose. Looking back now, I do not remember the flashing lights nearly as clearly as I remember the quiet moments. The smell of fresh coffee waiting on the kitchen counter. Emily carefully labeling another folder without a trace of frustration. Frank lowering his voice just enough to tell me the truth. The officers choosing to examine facts instead of assumptions. Those small moments mattered far more than any accusation ever could. I learned that real authority does not announce itself with volume, and real confidence does not need to intimidate anyone. It listens, it verifies, and it allows the truth enough time to reveal itself. Patricia believed power came from controlling the story. She never realized that stories built on assumptions eventually collapse under the weight of evidence. As for Emily and me, we still live in the same house, still wave to our neighbors every morning, and still believe the strongest victory is the one that leaves everyone free to move forward with greater respect than before. Justice never arrived with anger. It simply walked through our front door wearing a neatly pressed uniform, stood quietly beside the truth, and waited for everyone else to catch up.